Hello again, another session of Byte Theology, session 5, and this I've entitled Street Parties. They rolled out our piano into the street, Taff Street. I was just 9 years old. It was 1945, so you can do the arithmetic. We sang It's a Long Way to Tipperary, We'll Meet Again, Good Old Vera, Roll Out the Barrel. We had sandwiches and trifle, and the tables were the longest I've ever seen in my life, all the way up the street. Everyone was so happy, except possibly for one or two ladies who seemed to be crying now and then for the sons and daughters who didn't come back. I didn't know much then, of course, about doodlebugs over London, the horrible destruction in our cities. I didn't know much about the bombing of Dresden or the Holocaust. All that was yet to be learned. But 3 months later we did a replay. We did it all again. Roll out the barrel, bring out the piano, we'll meet again, and someday my prince will come for some reason or other, sticks in my mind. I didn't know much about Hiroshima then, or Nagasaki. I didn't know that it was Victory over Japan Day. I just knew it was another street party, and I got as many sandwiches and as much trifle as I could possibly manage. They were very happy days, and I thought maybe we did this every so often, have a street party. But no, those were just two rather special occasions. As I grew up, of course, I began to think. I went to church as a boy and sang in the choir. I even pumped the organ for my sister Paddy, who played the organ. She was the youngest organist in the whole of the Rhondda Valley at that time. And we sang the hymns. Onward Christian Soldiers was one of my favourites. And I listened to the sermons, especially the sermons that were preached by my uncle Will Dutfield, his name was. And he was a bit left-wing, a bit trade unionist and all that, and very fond of the teaching of Jesus. I even listened to him and absorbed a lot of what he said. And I remember asking myself the question, was Jesus okay with the war? Was God on our side during that war? Was Jesus a pacifist? Did he carry a sword? I remember one story from John's Gospel about the last night before he was betrayed. The last night when he was betrayed. His friend Peter took a sword and cut off the high priest's slave, his ear. I think his name was Malchus. Cut off his ear, and Jesus put it back on. I always thought that was very clever. But Peter obviously carried a sword. I thought, did they all his disciples carry swords? For defence, of course. Perhaps even Jesus himself carried a sword, although somehow I doubt it, because on that particular night he, according to St. John, was reputed to say, those who live by the sword shall perish by the sword. There was a man called Saul who was born about the same time as Jesus, give or take a few years, called Saul of Tarsus. And he was a persecutor of Christians. And there's a famous story told in the Acts of the Apostles of the first martyr, the first Christian martyr, Saint Stephen. He was stoned to death for blasphemy. It's a horrible thing. They dug a hole in those days and threw the criminal in and piled stones on top of him. A long and lingering death. But Saint Stephen is reputed to have said, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." Or were those the words of Jesus on the cross? In any case, he echoed the same sentiment. Forgiveness to those who perpetrated the awful crime. But this man, Saul, just stood by and watched the performance. He was a very sensitive man, very well educated, spoke many languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, a scholar, a rabbi, and of course a Roman citizen too. He must have been suffering from cognitive dissonance, being on the side of the Romans, and yet also later, when he was converted, he was on the side of the Christians. In fact, many would say that he was the founder of the Christian church. He wrote about a third of the New Testament, a man of great influence. And yet, you know, one thing about Paul that bothers me, he never said much about the teaching of Jesus. He talked a lot about the meaning of the cross and the meaning of the resurrection, but he didn't talk much about the teaching of Jesus. But he must have known those famous words, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Or you have heard it said of old, "An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you." I wonder what St. Paul would have thought of the declaration by the world's Anglican bishops in 1930 that war, they said, war as a method of settling international disputes is ultimately incompatible with the teaching of Christ. And they reiterated that statement in 1948 and in 1958 and in 1978. And I wonder what St. Paul would have thought of the words of Pope John Paul II, I believe at the Second Vatican Council, or was it his visit to Coventry, in which event he said, "Today the scale and horror of modern warfare, whether nuclear or not, makes it totally unacceptable as a means of settling differences between nations. War should belong to the tragic past. War should be confined to history." I would like to think so. Would you? Thank you for listening.